The recruit laughed at the black man's scars, then froze when the general said his call sign. "Attention! General Ava Vance in command!" The voice echoed through the elite Black Ops training facility's hangar, and all 600 operatives instantly snapped to attention. All except Private Skylar Jenkins, who was still whispering jokes about Sergeant Kian Maxwell's scars to her friends when the unthinkable happened. The four-star general stopped abruptly when she saw the quiet, unassuming maintenance officer at the back of the hangar, his service ribbons clinking in the deathly silence. Her face, hardened by decades of covert command, transformed into an expression of pure shock and reverence. "My God! Sentinel? Is that really you?" And then, in a scene that violated every Black Ops protocol known to man, General Vance saluted Sergeant Kian Maxwell, the same man Jenkins had called the mechanic because of the intricate scar patterns on his arms just 15 minutes earlier. Kian Maxwell was 38 years old and never imagined that his past would catch up with him in a remote, highly classified black site facility deep in the Nevada desert. He had deliberately chosen this isolated post, far from the spotlight of Washington, far from the commendations that haunted him, far from the fame that suffocated him. 3 weeks earlier, when he arrived at Site Omega as a simple maintenance officer, he brought with him only his quiet competence and the indelible marks of missions that were not recorded in any public file. The scars that ran across his forearms told stories that would cause experienced generals to lose sleep. Private Skylar Jenkins, 20 years old, fresh out of advanced infiltration training with impressive but not stellar scores, and a disproportionate ego, had spent weeks ridiculing the quiet black officer who had, in her youthful ignorance, obviously gotten his position through some legacy connection. She had invented cruel nicknames whispered among the rookies. "The mechanic, Sergeant Stitch, the damaged one." "He must have hurt himself trying to fix a toaster," she would sneer during breaks, eliciting nervous laughter from the other equally impressionable recruits. Or maybe he got into a fight with a leaky faucet and lost. What Jenkins didn't know, what no one there knew, was that she was mocking the most elusive and decorated operator in modern American covert history, a man whose real name was classified at the highest level, known only by the call sign Sentinel in the most secret circles of the Pentagon. Now, watching the most feared general in the U.S. Army bow to the man she had publicly humiliated, Jenkins felt the blood drain from her veins. Around her, the base veterans began to look at each other with expressions of growing understanding and silent terror. Something monumental was about to be revealed, and Jenkins had the terrible feeling that she would be the unwitting protagonist of her own destruction. If this story of disguised prejudice and hidden identities has piqued your curiosity, subscribe to the channel, because what happened in the next 15 minutes completely rewrote the hierarchy of that black site facility and turned an arrogant young operative into a legend of humility that would echo through the halls for decades. 3 weeks before that explosive moment in the hangar, Private Jenkins had arrived at Site Omega with the arrogance typical of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. The daughter of a decorated Special Forces colonel, she had grown up believing that the military was her private playground, where she could play operative without ever getting her hands dirty. Kian Maxwell, on the other hand, had deliberately chosen that remote base after spending 2 years trying to disappear from the military radar after Operation Nightfall, a mission so classified that it didn't even officially exist. He needed invisibility. The scars Jenkins mocked so much were reminders of when he carried 19 downed pilots through 60 kilometers of hostile, chemical-laced territory with shrapnel still lodged in his arms. "Look who's here to bore us to death," Jenkins announced every morning when Kian entered the hangar. "The mechanic is going to teach us about quantum field calibrators today. I hope he doesn't cut himself with the manual." Her friends laughed nervously. Corporal Ben Carter, a veteran of several covert deployments, always tried to change the subject, but Jenkins interpreted this as shyness, not the respect it really was. Master Sergeant Anya Sharma, who had served in deep cover operations, simply shook her head and walked away whenever Jenkins began her comments. "You guys are too sensitive," Jenkins would tease. "He's just a maintenance officer. He probably got the job because they needed to fill a diversity quota." Look at him. I bet he's never seen real combat. What Jenkins didn't notice were the subtle signs that any experienced operative would recognize immediately. The way Kian always positioned himself with his back to the wall, with a complete view of the room. How his eyes constantly made unconscious tactical sweeps. How he moved with the economy of gesture of someone trained to kill silently. During the second week, Jenkins's arrogance escalated dangerously. She began to accidentally bump into Kian in the hallways, always accompanied by comments about how he should be more careful not to hurt himself. Her friends stopped laughing. Even the newest recruits began to feel uncomfortable. "Sergeant Stitch," she called him loud enough for half the hangar to hear. "Maybe you should wear long sleeves. You're scaring the rookies with those marks." Kian stopped checking his equipment list, turned slowly, and looked Jenkins straight in the eye for 5 long seconds that seemed like an eternity. He studied her like a predator assessing its prey. There was no anger in that look. There was something much more disturbing, an icy calm that made Jenkins swallow involuntarily. "Private," he said finally, his voice low, but carrying an authority that seemed disproportionate to his rank. "Some scars tell stories you wouldn't want to hear." He walked away, leaving Jenkins with a strange feeling in her stomach. But instead of backing down, her immaturity made her interpret this as weakness. If he had yelled or reported her to his superiors, she would have respected that. But his calm response made her think she had found someone who wouldn't fight back. That's when she made her fatal mistake. On Friday of the third week, during the morning briefing, when Kian discreetly corrected a technical error made by Colonel Davies about quantum encryption systems, Jenkins couldn't contain herself. She whispered to her colleagues, but loud enough for some to hear. "Of course he knows about encryption. He probably cut himself trying to debug a spreadsheet at the academy." The silence that followed was deafening. Veterans at the base looked at each other with expressions ranging from horror to disbelief. Master Sergeant Sharma, a woman who had seen real combat on 3 continents, clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Kian heard it. Everyone knew he had heard it. But he didn't react. He didn't turn around. He didn't respond. He didn't report it. He simply continued taking notes in his usual perfect handwriting. At that moment, Jenkins sealed her fate, because what she interpreted as submission was actually the patience of someone who had spent years learning that the most devastating revenge is served cold. As the days passed, veterans at the base began to position themselves strategically, not to protect Kian. Anyone who knew him knew he didn't need protection. They were positioning themselves for the front row when the storm finally hit. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside him that his oppressors couldn't see, a silent strength fueled by the very injustice they sought to impose. What that privileged girl didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing her own sentence of defeat, and that when the time came for reckoning, there would be no place to hide on the entire base. What Jenkins didn't know was that every insult, every public humiliation, every gesture of contempt was being meticulously documented by eyes far more experienced than hers. Master Sergeant Sharma, a 23-year veteran, had recognized Kian on his first day, not by his face, but by the almost imperceptible tremor in his left hand. A telltale sign only known to those who'd undergone the same experimental neural interface procedure Kian had during Operation Nightfall. "There's something very wrong with that, Sergeant," Sharma had commented discreetly to Corporal Carter in the second week. "Very wrong. Did you see how he recalibrated that quantum frequency modulator during the inspection? 17 seconds. Blindfolded. What kind of maintenance officer does that?" Carter shook his head. "I tried to warn the kid, but she thinks she knows everything." In fact, Sharma had already sent discreet encrypted emails to some contacts at the Pentagon, asking careful questions about recently transferred officers. The responses she received were too vague to be accidental, the kind of vagueness that only exists when something is highly classified. Meanwhile, Kian maintained his routine of calculated invisibility. During the day, he performed his maintenance duties with quiet competence. But in the wee hours of the morning, when the base slept, he did something no ordinary maintenance officer would do. He conducted a thorough, tactical analysis of his environment. He had mapped every security camera, every access point, every night guard routine, not out of paranoia, but because after 7 years operating in hostile territory, assessing potential threats had become instinct, and Jenkins, with her growing arrogance and family backing, represented exactly the kind of threat he had learned to neutralize. In the 4th week, the situation escalated dangerously when Jenkins decided that verbal humiliation wasn't enough. During the mandatory close-quarters combat exercise, she deliberately chose Kian as her partner, claiming that someone needed to teach the mechanics some basic techniques. "Take it easy, Sergeant Stitch," she taunted loudly enough for the entire class to hear. "We don't want you getting hurt again." What happened in the next 3 minutes left 60 operatives in absolute silence. Kian not only neutralized all of Jenkins's attacks with disconcerting ease, he did so using techniques most of them didn't even recognize. When she tried to apply an arm lock she had learned in basic training, he countered with a move that left her pinned to the ground in less than 2 seconds, a micro-pressure point hold that made her whole arm tingle into numbness. "Nice technique, Private," he said calmly, offering his hand to help her up. "But you telegraphed the move with your left shoulder. In real combat, that would be fatal." Jenkins got up with her ego more bruised than her body, but instead of backing down, it only fueled her anger. She began spreading rumors that he had gotten lucky or was using dirty street tricks he had learned who knows where. That's when Kian made a decision that would seal Jenkins's fate. He began systematically documenting all of her behavior. Every derogatory comment disguised as a joke, every disrespectful gesture, every moment she abused her position to humiliate him publicly. But he wasn't doing it alone. Corporal Carter, who had served under Sentinel's direct command on an unofficial mission 3 years earlier, finally approached him after the incident in combat training. "Sergeant," he said when they were alone in the equipment storage room, "I know you can't confirm this, but if you are who I think you are, well, some of us are documenting Private Jenkins's behavior in case you need it." Kian studied him for a moment. "I don't know what you're talking about, Corporal." "Of course you don't," Carter smiled. "But if you did, you'd also know that that kid is digging her own grave. And when she's deep enough," he paused significantly, "well, let's just say that some important people are going to want to know exactly how an operative under disciplinary investigation managed to spend 3 weeks humiliating an officer with no consequences." From that day on, a silent network of veterans began operating on the base. Master Sergeant Sharma discreetly checked Jenkins's communication logs, discovering that she had been bragging about putting the mechanic in his place in encrypted message groups with other recruits. Master Sergeant Sharma began showing up coincidentally whenever Jenkins began her taunts, jotting down dates and times in a small notebook. And Kian? He remained the perfect target. Calm, professional, seemingly defenseless. But in the early hours of the morning, sitting in his Spartan room, he typed detailed reports on an encrypted laptop that officially did not exist. Each incident was documented with military precision. Date, time, witnesses, full context. What none of them knew was that Kian's transfer to Site Omega had not been as random as it seemed. General Vance had personally engineered that placement, knowing that after the events of Operation Nightfall, he needed time away from the spotlight to recover psychologically. But she had also left very specific instructions. Any irregularities involving Sergeant Maxwell were to be reported directly to her. The night before the inspection that would change everything, Kian received an encrypted message on his personal tablet. It was from Sharma. "Tomorrow, 8:30. Surprise inspection. General Ava Vance. Get ready." He looked out the window of his room, watching the lights on the base go out one by one. In less than 12 hours, the arrogant young operative who had spent an entire month underestimating him would find out exactly who she was messing with. But something in his gaze suggested that the revelation would only be the beginning, not the end, of what was to come. Because when you spend years learning that survival depends on strategic patience, you don't reveal your cards until you are absolutely sure that the game has been won. And while Jenkins slept peacefully, believing she had broken the spirit of yet another poor sergeant, Kian finished a report that would not only destroy her career, but serve as a case study on how prejudice and privilege can create fatal blind spots in future Black Ops leaders. The storm that was brewing wasn't just about personal justice. It was about sending a message to an entire generation of operatives who believed that some people were born to serve as stepping stones for others. And when General Vance read that report, she would discover that her protege hadn't just survived the test, he had turned humiliation into a masterclass on how to turn adversaries into examples. "Attention! General Ava Vance in command." The voice echoed through the hangar at 8:30 a.m., exactly as Sharma had predicted. 600 operatives instantly snapped to attention. But Jenkins was still whispering a last joke about Sergeant Stitch when the unthinkable happened. General Vance, a 4-decade veteran and commander of operations that had redefined global geopolitics, stopped abruptly when she spotted Kian at the back of the hangar. Her service ribbons clinked in the deathly silence as her hardened face turned into an expression of pure shock and reverence. "My God! Sentinel! Is it really you?" Jenkins's blood instantly turned to ice. Sentinel. That name meant only one thing in covert circles: the most lethal and elusive operative in modern American military history. The man who had saved 19 downed pilots in chemical-laced hostile territory. The ghost who infiltrated enemy bases alone and emerged with information that changed the course of entire wars. And then, something happened that violated every Black Ops protocol known. General Vance saluted Sergeant Kian Maxwell. "Colonel Maxwell," the general said, her voice heavy with genuine admiration. "It's an honor to have you back, even under these circumstances." The word colonel echoed through the hangar like a gunshot. Jenkins felt her legs buckle. Colonel? Not sergeant? She had spent 3 weeks publicly humiliating an officer who surpassed her own decorated father in rank and achievements. "Sir," Kian replied calmly, "I apologize for the breach of protocol. My identity was supposed to remain classified." "Nonsense," the general smiled. "Everyone," her voice cut through the air like a knife. "You have had the privilege of working alongside a living legend. This is Colonel Kian Sentinel Maxwell, architect of Operation Nightfall, responsible for missions that some of you have only heard whispered about in the corridors of the Pentagon." A murmur of admiration and shock rippled through the ranks. Seasoned veterans looked at each other with expressions ranging from reverence to disbelief. Some of the older operatives began to connect fragmented stories they had heard over the years. Jenkins was paralyzed, her mind slowly processing the magnitude of her ignorance. Every joke, every veiled racist comment, every gesture of disrespect came back to haunt her with devastating force. She had mocked a man whose achievements would make her own decorated father look like a Boy Scout. "General," Master Sergeant Sharma approached, carrying a bulging folder. "As requested, here is the complete documentation from the last 30 days. The general opened the folder, and her expression hardened gradually as she read pages and pages of detailed reports. Every comment Jenkins had made, every public humiliation, every gesture of disrespect, meticulously documented with a date, time, and witnesses. Discrete photos showed moments of harassment. Transcripts of recorded conversations revealed racist comments that Jenkins had thought were private jokes. "Private Jenkins!" The general's voice cut through the air like ice. "Step forward!" Jenkins advanced with trembling legs, each step echoing like a funeral drum. Around her, 600 pairs of eyes watched her with a mixture of horror and vengeful satisfaction. "Over the past 3 weeks," the general continued, her voice taking on an icy quality that made Jenkins break out in a cold sweat, "you have systematically harassed, humiliated, and shown racial disrespect toward a superior officer, an officer who could break you into 12 pieces before you even realized what was happening." "Sir, I didn't know," Jenkins stammered, her voice breaking pathetically. "Exactly," the general interrupted. "You didn't know, and you know why? Because your arrogance and privilege have created blind spots so huge that you've become incapable of recognizing excellence when it's right in front of you. Kian remained silent, watching the scene with the same professional calm he had maintained through weeks of humiliation. There was no triumph in his gaze, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice being served. "Corporal Carter," the general called, "read aloud Section 17 of the report." Carter approached, opening the document to a specific page. Private Jenkins publicly referred to Colonel Maxwell as the mechanic, suggesting that his combat scars were the result of domestic accidents. When informed by veterans to moderate her behavior, she responded verbatim, "He's just a maintenance officer who got his position through racial quotas." A deadly silence fell over the hangar. Racist comments were an absolute red line in the modern military, and Jenkins had not only crossed that line but danced on it publicly for weeks. "Those scars?" the general continued, gesturing to Kian's arms. "He got carrying 19 American pilots through 60 miles of hostile chemical-laced territory, with shrapnel still lodged in his flesh. Nonstop, no complaints. While you were in advanced training worrying about what mission your daddy was going to pull strings for." The public humiliation was complete and devastating. Jenkins could feel the contemptuous glances of everyone present burning her skin. Operatives who had laughed at her jokes now looked at her with obvious disgust. Veterans shook their heads with expressions of deep revulsion. "Colonel Maxwell," the general addressed Kian, "why didn't you report this behavior immediately?" "Sir," he replied calmly, "I believed it would be a valuable educational opportunity, both for Private Jenkins and to demonstrate how unconscious biases can compromise the efficiency of a Black Ops unit." The response was so diplomatic and wise that even the general was impressed. He had turned 3 weeks of humiliation into a master class on leadership and strategic patience. "Private Jenkins," the general turned her attention to the devastated young woman, "you will be immediately transferred to a remote experimental facility in the Arctic Circle, where you will spend the next 2 years learning about respect and humility. Your family will be notified of the disciplinary reasons for the transfer. This incident will remain permanently in your classified military file." Arctic Circle, remote facility, permanent file. Jenkins's covert career was over before it had even begun. 2 decades of privilege and arrogance destroyed in 15 minutes of accountability. "And one more thing," the general added, her voice carrying a coldness that made Jenkins shiver. "Colonel Maxwell could have ended your career on the first day. He could have broken you physically and mentally without even breaking a sweat. But he chose to give you time to learn and grow. You wasted that opportunity." As Jenkins was escorted out of the hangar under universal scornful glances, Kian remained motionless, watching her departure with the same serene expression he had maintained throughout the ordeal. There was no malice in his eyes, only the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice take its natural course. "Operatives," the general addressed the remaining soldiers, "let this be a permanent lesson. Excellence has no color, gender, or social origin. And underestimating someone based on prejudice is not just ignorance. It's a tactical flaw that can cost lives in actual combat." As the operatives dispersed, whispering among themselves about the extraordinary events they had just witnessed, one question remained in the air. How had someone who had survived war-defining operations managed to turn personal humiliation into a leadership lesson that would echo through the generations? And would Jenkins, now facing the full consequences of her arrogance, finally learn what it truly meant to serve with honor? 6 months later, Site Omega had become a case study in how a single revelation can completely transform the culture of a Black Ops installation. The name Sentinel echoed through the hallways, not as a distant legend, but as a daily reminder that excellence can come disguised in the most unexpected forms. Colonel Kian Maxwell, now officially recognized in his true rank, had been promoted to Deputy Commander of Covert Operations for the facility. His office, once a small cubicle in the maintenance wing, now occupied a large room overlooking the advanced training grounds, where young operatives learned not only combat techniques, but fundamental lessons about respect and humility. "Arrogance is the most lethal blind spot an operative can develop," he explained during his mandatory weekly lectures to all recruits. "It makes you deaf to the advice of veterans, blind to the skills around you, and eventually dead in the field. His story had become legend on the base. New operatives arrived, knowing about the officer who had turned 3 weeks of humiliation into a masterclass in strategic patience and calculated justice. The scars on his arms were no longer a source of morbid curiosity, but symbols of valor that inspired genuine respect. Meanwhile, at the Aurora Borealis outpost in the Arctic Circle, Private Skylar Jenkins faced a very different reality. Temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius were the least of her problems. Her reputation had preceded her. Everyone on the base knew exactly why she was there. "You're the kid who mocked the Sentinel?" Sergeant Boris Volkov asked on her first day, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Jesus Christ, kid. You really don't have any idea what you've done, do you?" The 2 years in the Arctic stretched out like a frozen eternity. Jenkins had lost not only the promising career she had imagined for herself, but also the respect of her colleagues, the trust of her family, and any chance of regaining her military reputation. Her father, Colonel Jenkins, had stopped taking her calls after the full details of the incident reached the upper echelons of command. "You have disgraced me, not only as a father but as an officer," were the last words he heard from the colonel. "Until you learn what true military service means, we have nothing more to discuss." Back at Site Omega, the transformation was remarkable. Corporal Carter had been promoted to sergeant and was working directly under Kian, helping to train the next generation of special operators. Master Sergeant Sharma had received commendation for her meticulous documentation of the case, which became study material at military academies across the country. "Never underestimate someone based on appearances," Sharma would repeat to each new class of recruits, holding up a photo of Kian during his early days as a simple maintenance officer. This man could have destroyed that girl on her first day, but he chose to teach her a lesson that is worth more than any physical punishment. The story had transcended the walls of the base. Kian received invitations to speak at West Point, the Naval Academy, and prestigious universities. His upcoming book, Silent Leadership: Lessons from the Battlefield for Civilian Life, became required reading in management and organizational psychology courses. "True power does not come from humiliating those who underestimate you," he wrote in the final chapter. "It's in turning that underestimation into an opportunity for education and growth, both for yourself and for those who need to learn." During one of General Vance's visits 9 months after the incident, she found Kian reviewing mission reports in his new office. The walls were decorated not with his medals, which remained in storage, but with photos of operatives he had trained and thank-you letters from families he had helped. "Any regrets about how you handled the Jenkins situation?" she asked, genuinely curious. Kian reflected for a moment. "No regrets, sir. She got exactly what her actions deserved. But I hope that eventually she understands that her experience in the Arctic wasn't a punishment. It was an opportunity for rebirth." And he was right. 2 years later, Jenkins returned from the Arctic, a changed woman. Not just physically, the cold had toughened her body, but mentally. She had spent 24 months dealing with the consequences of her arrogance, working under officers who would not tolerate disrespect, serving alongside operatives who knew her story and had no patience for privileged attitudes. When she finally returned to the mainland, she was no longer the arrogant young woman who had humiliated a war hero. She was a woman who had learned, in the hardest way possible, that true military value has no color, gender, or social origin. Her first act was to write a letter to Kian, a letter he kept on his desk, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even hearts hardened by privilege can learn to grow. "Colonel Maxwell," the letter read, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I now understand what I wasted, not just the opportunity to learn from one of the best, but the chance to be a better operative from day one. If I ever have the opportunity to serve again, I will earn the uniform I wear." Kian's response was brief but meaningful. "Private Jenkins, we all deserve second chances. The question is not whether you deserve them, but what you will do with them." Today, Site Omega is known not only as an efficient Black Ops facility, but as an example of how true leadership can transform a toxic culture into an environment of excellence. Young officers from across the country request transfers there, not for the ease, but for the opportunity to learn from someone who proved that true military strength comes from competence, not arrogance. The best revenge, Kian often says in his lectures, is not to destroy those who hurt you. It is to build something so great, so meaningful, that the injustice you suffered becomes just a stepping stone to something extraordinary. He turned 3 weeks of humiliation into a career that inspires thousands. Jenkins tried to break him, but ended up breaking only her own illusions about privilege and superiority. In the end, the man she called Sergeant Stitch taught an entire generation that the deepest scars are not those we carry on our skin, they are those we carry in our character. What about you? Have you ever underestimated someone based on appearances? Have you ever discovered that the person you looked down on was actually much more than you imagined? Leave your experience in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true greatness often comes disguised as simplicity, and that judging a book by its cover can be the most expensive mistake you'll ever make in your life.